The night in the plantation was heavy with the smell of damp earth and the slow whisper of the wind passing through the pine trees. Far in the fields, the cabins of the slaves crouched low and silent, their roofs dark against the faint moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and then fell quiet. Isaac sat near the doorway of his cabin, his rough hands resting on his knees. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face had been carved by years of toil and hardship. The others in the cabin, women, old men, and a few children, looked to him as if he were already their guide, though he himself said little. In the big house on the hill, the masters were still awake. Candles flickered behind the windows, and the sound of drunken laughter occasionally drifted out into the night. Isaac could hear it even from where he sat. His jaw tightened. He remembered the years of humiliation, the lashes on his back, the long hours in the fields under the burning Virginia sun. He remembered the cries of mothers whose children had been sold away. That night, a slow, burning thought had begun to take shape in his mind, an idea he had never allowed himself to voice before. A boy of 12 came up to him and whispered, "They'll be drunk again tonight, won't they?" Isaac did not answer at first. Then he said, his voice low and steady, "Sleep, child. Tomorrow will be another long day." But as the boy curled up beside the fire, Isaac's gaze went to the rough-bladed butcher's knife hanging by the wall. It had once been given to him for slaughtering hogs. Now it glinted dully in the firelight as if waiting. That same night, in another cabin, Elias, a younger man, quick-footed and sharp-eyed, was speaking in hushed tones to a small group of men. "We can't live like this forever," he said. "We've lost too many. The river is not far. If we break out together, we may reach the hills before they catch us." One of the older men shook his head. "They've got rifles. And dogs. If they catch us." Elias lowered his voice further. "Isaac will lead us. You've seen his strength. He won't let them take us alive." The others glanced at one another uneasily. The name of Isaac carried weight, like a shadow that promised both protection and danger. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the shutters of the cabin. Somewhere far away, thunder muttered over the horizon. In the big house, the master, an aging man grown harsh and mean with years of unchecked power, had fallen asleep at the table, his head heavy with wine. The mistress still moved from room to room like a restless shadow, sometimes calling for the servants to bring her more drink, sometimes cursing them when they were too slow. In the slave cabins, the fire burned low. The men lay awake, staring into the darkness, listening to the distant laughter from the big house and the sigh of the wind in the trees. Isaac did not sleep. He sat upright, staring at the knife. Slowly, almost without realizing it, he reached out and wrapped his calloused fingers around the worn wooden handle. For a long moment he held it, feeling the weight in his palm. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted. The moon slid behind a thick bank of clouds, and the night deepened, heavy and waiting. The next evening, the air over the fields was thick and damp, carrying with it the scent of rain. Dark clouds gathered low over the horizon as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Isaac worked in silence through the day, hauling sacks of grain to the mill. The overseer shouted now and then, cracking his whip more out of habit than need. Isaac barely looked up. His thoughts were somewhere far away, deep and heavy like the river that ran through the forest beyond the plantation. By nightfall, when the slaves had returned to their cabins, a nervous energy spread among them. They spoke in whispers, glancing often toward Isaac's cabin as if waiting for a signal. Elias slipped inside, his eyes darting to the door before he sat down across from Isaac. "They'll be drunk again tonight," he said quietly. "The young master brought more whiskey from town. I saw the wagon." Isaac didn't speak at once. He kept sharpening the edge of the butcher's knife on a flat stone. The sound of the steel scraping the stone filled the dimly lit cabin. Finally, he said, without looking up, "If we do this, there's no turning back. You know that." Elias nodded. "We've been running for years, only to be dragged back. We've lost mothers, brothers. If we wait longer, there will be nothing left of us. It's time." An older woman in the corner raised her hands in prayer. "God forgive you both if this leads to bloodshed," she murmured, her eyes wet with fear. Isaac stood and looked at the small gathering of men and women. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "They've lived by the whip and the chain. They will not let us go. We have to choose, die on our knees or stand and fight. The cabin fell into silence. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the roof. That night, as the storm rolled in, the big house on the hill glowed with lamplight. Music played faintly from a cracked old violin. Laughter drifted out through the rain. The masters and their guests were celebrating some harvest deal, their cups full and their wits dulled. Down by the cabins, shadows moved silently. Isaac, Elias, and a few others slipped out into the night, keeping low beneath the storm-tossed trees. They moved like hunters, though it was their own lives they meant to reclaim. Lightning flickered across the sky, throwing brief flashes of silver across Isaac's grim face. The knife at his belt caught the light for an instant, then vanished into darkness again. The rain fell harder. The sound of it on the leaves almost drowned out the crack of distant thunder. By the time they reached the edge of the yard that led up to the big house, the ground was slick and muddy. Isaac raised a hand, signaling the others to stop. They crouched low beneath a wooden fence, waiting for the right moment. Inside the house, the violin squealed a drunken tune. Glasses clinked. A man's harsh laugh rang out, followed by the shrill voice of the mistress scolding a servant. Isaac's jaw tightened. He glanced at Elias, who gave a small nod. Then, in one swift motion, Isaac vaulted the fence and strode across the wet grass toward the open door of the kitchen. Elias and the others followed, their hearts pounding like drums. A servant girl inside the kitchen gasped when she saw them but said nothing. Her eyes followed Isaac as he passed, and then she looked away, crossing herself. The first of the masters barely had time to rise from his chair before Isaac was upon him. The rain-lashed wind swept into the room as the door swung wide. In that moment of chaos, the thunder, the flash of lightning, the shout of a startled man, the long years of Isaac's silence finally broke. No words, only the cold steel of the butcher's blade, moved that night. By the time the storm began to ease, the laughter in the big house had turned into screams and then into silence. Outside, the rain washed through the muddy yard, carrying away the footprints and the first traces of blood. The slaves who had waited behind in the cabins listened in terror and awe as the distant thunder rolled over the hills, unsure if it was the storm or the echo of something far more human. Elias returned near dawn, his clothes torn and wet, his face pale but resolute. "It's done," he whispered to those who waited. "We move at first light. The road to the river is open." In his cabin, Isaac sat alone, his hands still and heavy on his knees. He stared at the dying embers of the fire. Outside, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. He had crossed the line that night, there would be no return. But for the first time in his life, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. The dawn after the storm came gray and heavy, the air still damp from the night's rain. Mist hung low over the fields, curling around the dark shapes of the cabins and the fence posts. The plantation that had once roared with the voices of overseers and the crack of the whip now stood eerily quiet. Isaac stepped out of his cabin, his shirt torn at the shoulder, the butcher's knife still hanging at his belt. His face was calm but his eyes held the weight of what had passed. He looked across the yard toward the big house, now silent and still, its windows dark as hollow eyes. Elias came up behind him, speaking in a low voice. "We can't stay here. They'll come when they find out. We have to move before the soldiers arrive." Isaac nodded slowly. "Wake the others. Take only what we can carry. We go for the river." Word spread quickly among the cabins. Mothers wrapped blankets around their children, men gathered a few tools and sacks of dried food. They moved like shadows in the lingering mist, fearful but driven by the memory of what had been endured, and what had been done the night before. By mid-morning, the group set out across the fields, keeping low and close to the hedgerows. The sky was overcast, the air cool and damp. The earth was soft beneath their bare feet. As they passed the edge of the fields, Isaac turned one last time to look back at the plantation. For a moment, he saw in his mind all the years he had spent there, days of labor beneath the scorching sun, nights of pain and silence. Then he turned away and kept walking. They moved through the outer woods, following narrow animal trails toward the river. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they went, like a distant promise. But they were not the only ones on the move. Back at the plantation, a lone rider had arrived at dawn, a neighbor who had found the silence of the big house strange. What he saw inside sent him galloping to the nearest town with news of the massacre. By noon, a detachment of armed men was gathering to hunt the fugitives. Elias, walking a little ahead of the group, noticed fresh hoofprints in the damp soil. He crouched to study them, his brow furrowing. "They'll come after us," he said to Isaac. "We need to reach the river before nightfall." Isaac's gaze swept over the weary faces of the women and children. "Then we keep moving," he said. "No stopping till we cross." Through the long afternoon they pressed on, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they climbed low ridges and forded shallow streams. The children clung to their mothers, the men took turns carrying the weakest among them. By evening, the trees thinned and the glimmer of the river came into view. Its waters ran swift and dark beneath the pale sky. The fugitives gathered at the edge of the water, exhaustion etched into every face. Elias waded in first, testing the depth and the current. "We can cross here," he said. "Hold on to each other." One by one they stepped into the cold water. The current pulled at their legs, but they moved carefully, gripping one another's arms. Then, from the woods behind them, came the sharp crack of a rifle shot. A bullet hissed into the river, throwing up a small splash near the lead man. Shouts followed, the hunters had arrived. Panic rippled through the group. A child cried out, and a woman clutched him tighter, urging him to be silent. Elias turned to Isaac. "I'll help them cross. You hold them off." Isaac's eyes were steady as he drew the butcher's knife and picked up a broken tree limb to use as a staff. "Go," he said. The hunters on horseback emerged from the trees, their faces grim, rifles raised. Isaac stepped forward into the shallows, planting himself between his people and the men who came to drag them back. His voice rang out over the rush of the river. "You'll take no one from here." The first rider spurred his horse forward. Isaac swung the heavy branch, striking the animal's head. The horse reared, throwing the rider into the water. The others shouted and fired, but the chaos of the riverbank and the gathering dusk made their shots wild. Behind him, the fugitives struggled through the current, Elias helping the women and children up the far bank. Another rider came at Isaac with a pistol drawn. Isaac caught the man's arm, yanked him from the saddle, and struck him down. A shot went off, grazing Isaac's shoulder, but he barely flinched. The fight raged in the shallows until at last the fugitives reached the opposite bank. Elias called out to Isaac across the water. "Come on, it's enough." Isaac turned his head slightly, his face wet with river spray and blood. "Go," he shouted. "Get them to safety." He drove his branch into the ground, bracing himself for the next rush of riders. Night was falling when the fugitives, soaked and shivering, gathered on the far bank. They looked back through the darkness, seeing only flashes of gunfire and the dark shape of Isaac still standing in the river. Some wept, others prayed. Elias stood silent, his fists clenched at his sides. At last the sounds of gunfire grew distant, drowned by the roar of the river. The fugitives turned away and began their march into the forest beyond, carrying with them the memory of the man who had stood between them and their pursuers. The forest beyond the river was deep and dark, a tangle of old oaks and pine whose branches blocked the moonlight. The fugitives moved silently, their wet clothes clinging to their skin, their breath steaming in the cold night air. Elias led the way, keeping his eyes on the faint trail left by deer. Behind him, the women and children stumbled but pressed on, urged forward by fear as much as by hope. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made them freeze for a heartbeat before they moved again. By dawn they had covered many miles. The forest opened into a stretch of wild meadow where the tall grass shimmered with dew. They collapsed there in silence, too exhausted even to speak. Elias stood watch while the others rested. His eyes searched the treeline behind them, half expecting to see riders emerge at any moment. But the woods remained still. When the sun rose higher, they moved again, skirting the meadows and heading deeper into the wilderness. They needed distance between themselves and the men who would surely hunt them. By midday they came upon an abandoned trapper's hut near a stream. The roof sagged, and the walls were gray with age, but it offered shelter. The fugitives gathered inside. A few of the older women tended to the children, rubbing their chilled hands and feet. One man found a pile of old firewood and coaxed a small flame to life, filling the hut with a smell of damp smoke. Elias sat apart, staring at the small fire. His thoughts were with Isaac. He wondered if his friend still lived or had fallen in the river's defense. The memory of Isaac's last shout, "Get them to safety," echoed in his ears. That night, they took turns keeping watch. The forest was alive with distant sounds, the cry of owls, the snapping of twigs, the rush of the stream. The stars were hidden by drifting clouds, and the air smelled of rain. Toward midnight, Elias heard a faint sound from the woods. His hand went to the axe that lay beside him. The noise came again, soft footfalls, cautious but approaching. He rose slowly, heart hammering in his chest. "Who's there?" he called in a low voice. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. Then a figure stepped into the dim light of the dying fire. It was Isaac. He stood weary and drenched, his clothes torn and blood-stained, but he was alive. His eyes found Elias's, and a faint smile flickered across his face before he staggered forward and sank to his knees. Elias rushed to him, catching his shoulders. "You made it," he said, his voice breaking. Isaac nodded weakly. "Crossed, when it was dark. They won't follow till morning." The women gathered around, whispering prayers of thanks. One of them brought a strip of cloth and bound the gash on Isaac's arm. By the firelight, Isaac told them what had happened at the riverbank, the fight, the shots, the riders forced back by the rising waters. Some of the fugitives wept, others bowed their heads in silence. For the first time in many years, they felt a glimmer of hope. The next days were a blur of travel. They moved at dawn, rested by hidden streams at noon, and pressed on again till dusk. Isaac, though wounded, walked at the front, his presence giving strength to the others. They skirted small towns and avoided open roads, knowing patrols might be searching for them. Once they heard distant hoofbeats and hid among boulders till the danger passed. Food grew scarce. They lived on roots, wild berries, and what little they could snare in the woods. The children grew thin, their faces pale, but they kept walking. On the seventh day, they reached the edge of a wide marshland. Beyond it lay the faint glow of distant lights, the sign of a settlement. Elias stood beside Isaac, staring at the marsh. "We can't cross this at night," he said. "The ground's too soft. We'll have to wait till dawn." Isaac nodded. "We'll rest here. Tomorrow we move." They made a small camp under the shelter of willow trees. The night was quiet except for the distant croak of frogs and the soft murmur of wind over the reeds. Isaac sat alone for a long time, staring out at the dark expanse of the marsh. He thought of all the faces he had left behind at the plantation, those lost to cruelty, those who had died in chains. He had no illusions about what awaited them ahead, but for the first time in his life, the road belonged to them. At dawn, the fugitives set out again, moving in a slow line through the marsh. The mud sucked at their feet, and the reeds brushed against their shoulders. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds. Midway through the crossing, the sound of distant dogs drifted across the wind. The hunters had found their trail. Elias looked at Isaac, his face grim. "They're close." Isaac tightened his grip on the staff he carried. "Then we keep moving. There's no going back now." The marsh stretched before them, the settlement's faint lights still miles away. Behind them, the dogs' baying grew louder, carrying across the open wetland like a warning. The marsh seemed endless. The reeds hissed in the morning wind, and the mud clung to their legs as they struggled forward. Every step felt heavier than the last. The children stumbled, and the women lifted them into their arms. Behind them, the baying of hounds grew louder. The hunters were drawing near. Isaac turned his head once, his dark eyes sweeping the misty expanse behind them. He could see nothing yet, only the shifting reeds, but he knew the riders were coming. "Keep moving," he said, his voice low but firm. "Don't stop for anything." The fugitives pressed on. The mud came up to their knees in places, sucking at their feet with a wet slurp. The air smelled of brine and decaying plants. By midday they reached a strip of higher ground where a cluster of willow trees offered some shelter. There they stopped to rest, their chests heaving, their faces streaked with sweat and mud. Isaac stood watch at the edge of the rise, staring back toward the way they had come. Elias came to stand beside him. "They're close," he said. "We can't outrun the dogs much longer." Isaac said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. "Get them to the settlement. I'll hold them off again if I have to." Elias shook his head. Not this time. We'll stand together. Isaac looked at him, and for the first time in many days, a faint, tired smile touched his lips. Then let's make it count. They moved on as soon as the children had caught their breath. The land rose slowly beyond the marsh, and through the haze they could see the faint outline of rooftops, the settlement, still distant but closer now than ever. The sight gave the fugitives a surge of strength. They quickened their pace, though every step sent pain lancing through their weary bodies. But as they climbed the last ridge of marshland, the riders appeared behind them, dark shapes on horseback breaking through the morning mist, the dogs surging ahead, their baying echoing across the reeds. Panic rippled through the group. A few of the younger boys wanted to run, but Isaac raised a hand. "Stay together," he said. "We make our stand if we have to." They pressed on, the ground firmer now under their feet. The first scattered shots cracked the air, bullets hissing past them. A woman cried out as a ball grazed her arm, but Elias pulled her forward, refusing to let her fall behind. When they reached a narrow gully with a shallow stream trickling through it, Isaac stopped. "Here," he said. "We hold them here long enough for the others to reach the settlement." The men among the fugitives hesitated, but one by one they stepped forward, taking up sticks, stones, and the few tools they had carried. Elias turned to the women. "Get the children up that rise. Head for the lights. Don't look back." The women gathered the children and hurried them up the slope, glancing over their shoulders as they went. Isaac stood in the stream, the water swirling around his ankles. He held his butcher's knife in one hand, a heavy branch in the other. His eyes were fixed on the riders as they approached. The first wave of dogs reached the stream. Isaac swung the branch, striking one aside and kicking another back into the water. The animals snarled and lunged, but the fugitives fought them off with sticks and stones. Then the riders came thundering down the slope. The clash was fierce and desperate, men with nothing but farm tools and bare hands against rifles and sabers. Elias wrenched a rifle from a rider's grasp and fired point blank, dropping another who charged. Isaac fought with a grim, silent fury, cutting, striking, pushing the enemy back step by step. The stream turned red as the battle raged. At last, the distant sound of a bell carried on the wind, the settlement's alarm. Shouts rose from beyond the ridge as townsfolk, hearing the commotion, began to gather. The riders hesitated, glancing toward the approaching figures. They had not expected resistance so near a settlement. Seizing the moment, Isaac raised his voice over the roar of the fight. "Go, get the rest to safety." Elias hesitated for only a heartbeat, then turned and signaled the others to retreat up the rise. Isaac stood alone in the stream as the last of the fugitives scrambled up the slope and disappeared toward the settlement. The riders regrouped, circling him like wolves around a wounded bull. Isaac's chest heaved, his arms heavy, but he stood his ground. Another charge came, and he met it with a hoarse cry, swinging the branch in a wide arc, knocking a man from his horse. A saber slashed his side, but he stayed on his feet, fighting as if the river itself flowed in his veins. From the ridge above, Elias looked back one last time. He saw Isaac standing in the stream, surrounded yet unbowed, and his heart clenched with both grief and pride. The fugitives reached the outskirts of the settlement as the townsfolk came out with lanterns and muskets. Seeing the battered, mud-streaked faces of the women and children, the settlers quickly formed a line to defend them. Gunfire echoed across the marsh as the riders, realizing they were outnumbered and cut off from easy escape, finally pulled back. But Isaac did not follow the fugitives to safety. When the first light of dawn touched the marsh, Elias went back down the ridge with two settlers at his side. They found the stream quiet, the water flowing dark and still. Isaac lay where he had stood, his face turned toward the rising sun. Elias knelt beside him, his hands tightening into fists. "You brought them home," he whispered. They buried Isaac there at the edge of the marsh, beneath the willows that swayed in the morning breeze. Years later, the story of the man who had once been called Isaac the Butcher was told in whispers and in songs among those who had escaped. Not as a tale of blood, but as a memory of the night a man who had been born a slave stood unbroken against those who sought to drag them back into chains. His name lived on, not in fear, but in defiance, carried by those who crossed rivers and forests to claim their freedom. For more such true and chilling stories, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the bell icon.